Welcome back to the Oscar Project Podcast, the show where I discuss Oscar-nominated films year by year. I am your host, Jonathan Eaterberg, and today I'm discussing the 1927 film Seventh Heaven with my friend Maria Banson, who writes the Brunello Bombshell newsletter. Maria, thank you so much for joining me to talk about Seventh Heaven today.
Hello, everyone.
So before we jump into talking about the film, tell listeners a little bit more about yourself, if you could.
So I am a certified sommelier that has a background in entertainment work. I have a classical voice degree and I've worked a lot with regional theaters, and I happen to marry a filmmaker. So Brunello Bombshell Substack is all about the merging of wine and movies and all forms of entertainment. I focus on a lot of wine and movie pairings, but I also host a weekly wine news podcast. And I talk about things that I've seen throughout the month, and I love talking about award season specifically, which is why I love Jonathan's work so much.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for coming on the podcast to talk about Seventh Heaven today. And I will say, before we get too far into things, today is Valentine's Day, February 14th, sorry. So it's a good day to be talking about this love story. And it is my 100th episode of the podcast. So you're lucky episode 100 today.
I'm very honored. Thank you very much for having me on.
So I want to get into talking a little bit about Seventh Heaven. It debuted on May 6th, 1927. It was directed by Frank Borzage from a screenplay by Benjamin Glazer, with titles by Harry H. Caldwell and Catherine Hilliker. The film was based on a play of the same name by Austin Strong.
It stars Janet Gaynor as Diane, Charles Farrell as Chico, and Ben Bard as Colonel Brissac. The film runs for 110 minutes, and it was produced by William Fox and distributed by Fox Film Corporation.
Seventh Heaven received the most nominations at the very first Academy Awards with 5, winning 3 of those categories, including Best Directing for Dramatic Picture, Best Actress, and Best Writing Adaptation. You can find some DVDs of the film on eBay. I'm not sure how good those are, but it is also readily available on YouTube as of this recording and is in the public domain. So let's get into the story. We start off in Paris and we get to meet Chico and Diane. Chico's working as a sewer cleaner, I guess, and dreams of becoming a street cleaner. So moving from below the streets up above the streets. And then we meet Diane, who's kind of living in, I guess you could call it living in squalor a little bit with her sister Nana. And the two of them get some news that their rich aunt and uncle have just come home from traveling the world. And the aunt and uncle are on their way to see them. So what were your first thoughts of these two when we first meet them?
It's interesting to see different lives of Paris in 1910s, I think, is when that preliminary prologue act was set. It feels very reminiscent of the first act of Moulin Rouge in that respect.
Okay, yeah, hadn't thought about that.
While there aren't starving artists in that regard, they do feel like the very lower class of rebuilding Paris. There is something interesting about that sister relationship that I feel like needs to be touched on, because we don't see a lot of sister on sister violence in movies.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, it was a little bit surprising, especially as we go on to the next part. The aunt and uncle come home, they say, basically they're asking, have you girls been good? And the Nana, the sister, is like, oh yeah, we've been great. And Diane's like, not really. We've kind of been not doing so great.
yeah, but I love that that's so coded, because in early movies, you can't necessarily say, yeah, we've had to sell ourselves out in order to make ends meet. And I was thinking about it as watching the movie, because this is almost 100 years old now. We are now in an awards season with a lot of stories about prostitution and how people make their money with the oldest profession possible, and how that is now an awards-worthy performance.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting, just kind of going back through the other films that I've touched on, this season. One of the other two that Gaynor was nominated for and won the Oscar for Best Actress was Street Angel, which also coincidentally stars Charles Farrell. And again, Street Angel, that whole title refers to someone who does that profession as well. And then also the film Sadie, Thompson is also about a prostitute. So it's, you say, yeah, they couldn't say much about it, but it seemed like it was still a big topic at the time.
Certainly on top of mine.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, definitely the scene where the sister kind of starts beating her up and she runs out of the house and basically chases her through the streets, kind of beating on her was a little bit shocking.
Yeah. Ooh, and a lot to take in, especially with I think the part that came afterwards really got to me. Yes, we realize it is a man saving a woman,
Mhm.
but it was the man kind of begrudgingly saving a woman after she had been cast out on the street and she had been, temporarily saved from a very drastic situation. Chico and his homies were not having it. They were just
Yeah,
kind of leaving her there.
that whole sequence surprised me a little bit that, they're just sitting there splitting their loaf of bread and having a little break from work, and seems like they're about ready to go back down and do some more sewer cleaning and just leave her there on the street. But things do change a little bit. He ends up proclaiming the police come around, rounding up some of the ladies, and the sister has already been arrested. She's already been picked up, and she claims that Diana is one of them. But then Chico steps in, valiant man here to save the day, and says, "Oh, no, 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 that's my wife," which of course creates its own new set of problems since they're not actually married.
Yeah. And then, of course, the comment about I always wanted a wife with yellow hair and this is what I got.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. He's just settling left, right, and center. And that's the whole thing. That stepping back just as a little bit to the whole conversation that him and his buddies have before while she's kind of unconscious laying nearby. It seemed a very very religious conversation to be having with your work buddies, because he talks about how he went to church and paid the money to get basically favor with God, but he just keeps getting short end of the stick essentially.
That's something that I would love to touch on with you. There seem to be a lot of religious overtones in this movie,
Yeah.
especially for a movie about prostitution.
Yeah, exactly. It was, and it came up here and there, and it didn't seem it wasn't a consistent theme in that it was in every single scene, but it kept popping up over and over again,
Yeah,
enough that I think it was really, really important.
yeah, a driving character in the movie for sure.
So we get the scene where he proclaims her as his wife, and then the police inspector basically says, "All right, yeah, but we'll have to come by your house and verify this later on," which seemed a little bit odd, but okay. And of course, then he starts to get a little bit worried that they're not married, so how are they going to prove that he wasn't lying? And she comes up with the genius idea of, well, why don't I come over and stay with you for a little bit until they come and check on that? And some of those things just seemed a little bit too coincidental, too convenient, not just there, but throughout the whole film. A lot of the things were just very convenient to make the plot as thin as it was, kind of keep moving forward.
It's the movies and early movies at that. I would like to think that moviegoers have gotten just a hair savvier since
Oh, yes.
1927.
Yes, I agree.
But it's fascinating to see where the art form really started and how sometimes you just kind of need to hit people over the head with a point.
Yeah, yeah, and of course, I mean, obviously, it's a silent film, so
Yeah.
we're communicating this all through a few words on the screen here and there. But, yeah, a lot of it just seemed very, very convenient. So, of course, they turned to his apartment, and this was one of the points, several instances where I saw some really cool cinematography things that they were doing with the moving camera. There's one early on when she's first walking through the streets on her own. Kind of, there's a tracking shot that follows her through the streets. But then this one was, I think, my favorite, where they're walking down the hall of the apartment building. The camera's kind of following on a track behind them, and then they start walking up the spiral staircase, and the camera goes up 4 or 5 floors at least along with them as they're going up the spiral staircase. I thought that was a really cool effect,
Yeah.
especially given the time period.
Absolutely. We'll get to the staircase and where it leads up to in a second, but in the rest of the film, I think that is the most romantic shot of that staircase. We do see people going up the stairs and making the flight upwards, which becomes a thematic point later on, but that is by far the most romantic view that we have of that really crappy apartment.
Yeah, so they make it up to that apartment, and again, you say really crappy, but I actually thought it was a pretty big, expansive apartment. Maybe it's just because it's way up on the top
It
floor.
looks exactly like the apartment in Moulin Rouge. Tell me I'm wrong.
Yeah, yeah, I hadn't even thought about that film, but now that you're saying it, I can definitely see some inspiration there.
I'm glad, thank you.
Yeah, so they get up to that apartment, and he, basically gets her. He's showing her the view of the city. And the other thing that did remind me of was a little bit of Aladdin, when Aladdin takes Jasmine up to the rooftop and is showing her the view of the city. So I wonder if that's a little bit of inspiration there.
That's very clever. Oh, I like that.
So he's showing her the view of the city. She's a little bit scared because of the height. And I think the important part of this scene was that he tells her never to look down, always be looking up to the heavens, obviously seventh heaven of the title. So that's kind of the always keep your chin up, always be proud of who you are, even if you're not, necessarily the highest of society. So I think that was another big thematic moment that came in there.
Yeah. And the fact to have courage and look up when because Janet Gaynor had been directed to look down so often in the first part of the film, the fact that he's literally saying, "Look up so that we can see more of your face."
Yeah,
She's such a petite woman.
she is.
To have I mean, she looks great on screen, especially in contrast to Charles Farrell, who is huge.
Yeah.
But to have her literally look up so you can see more of her eyes and more of her neck, which elongates her and gives her like half a foot more height, it makes a difference in the way that the character holds herself and the way that the character is presented on screen too.
Yeah, for sure. And then she kinda heads to bed, and this was another part that I noted when I was, watching the film. Obviously, throughout that whole first sequence until we get to this apartment scene, she's in a black dress, obviously a little bit representative of her profession, or her what she's doing to make ends meet. And then she takes off that black dress and she climbs into the bed, presumably his bed, and she's wearing, a white, nightgown, something underneath that is all white. I wasn't sure if I was reading too much into that, but I want to think that that was done intentionally to show that maybe she's being given a fresh start with him in some way.
Yeah, I like that. I hadn't really thought about that, but the what I saw was the shedding of the outer clothes to get into the inner clothes, which is more of her inner soul. But now that you're commenting on the fact that it is pure white, because it has to be the thing that gets all the things dirty, that's a really big character shift too.
Yeah, and obviously, and I was thinking about it later on towards the end when in the very last scene, actually, she's wearing again a white now a not just an underdress, but an actual white dress. We'll get to that later. So he ends up sleeping out on the kind of the balcony, so that he's not in bed with her. And then we get to see a couple of scenes with him and his neighbor across the next building. And I love that part where they're just walking across these wooden planks from one building to another to climb in each other's windows and stuff. Again, it speaks to the time period, I think, and I don't know if that's what people actually did during that time, but it doesn't seem like you would see that in anything today.
No, I think people are way too scared of heights to be able to do that. And
Yeah.
also, building codes would probably have something to say about that.
Yes, exactly. So his friend, Gobin, I think his name was, are now the street cleaners together. He's able to make it out of the sewers and onto the streets. So still a very lowly profession in terms of what I would think of, but obviously some sort of promotion, some sort of moving up the social ladder for him.
Well, unless we forget that promotion was given by the local priest.
Yes,
So
yes.
everything connects back to the church and to the religious figures of the day.
Right, and that was one of the things he'd complained about initially was that he asked for this being raised up out of the sewers, and God had not granted that to him, but then, of course, here comes the priest and gives him what he wants. So eventually we get the, police inspector. I don't know if it's the same one, but some police inspector comes back to verify the relationship, and I thought that inspection was very truncated. I mean, he basically knocks on the door, says, "Is she your wife?" And he goes, "Yeah, yeah, she is." And like, "All right, cool. I'm out of here." And that's the end of it.
Bare minimum job, but you know what? It moves the plot along.
Exactly. And before they'd gotten back to the apartment, Chico had been telling her, "Don't get too comfortable. As soon as they check on this, you're out of here. I'm not going to be held down dealing with you for the rest of my life." But as she starts to head out the door after the inspector leaves, she's like, "Oh, no, no, stick around for a little while. I'm not bothered by you," I think is what he said.
Yeah, that sounds about right. But then we realize they're smitten or at least some sort of dependent more than just that
Yes.
situation.
Yeah. So they obviously there's a relationship building there, and is it he brings home a wedding dress for her, if I'm remembering correctly.
Was it the wedding dress or was it something else? I can't remember.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly, but they decide to get married, quote unquote, and basically marry each other, kind of in the eyes of God, if you will, because they're the only ones there, and do that right before him and his buddy Gobin are sent off to war. And I was assuming all of this was World War One. That's the only real situation that makes sense here,
Yeah.
but it's never really specifically stated. So there's kind of, I thought, a prolonged scene of the two of them lamenting. They're finally realizing that they're in love with each other, but now Chico's got to go off and fight in the war, and she's going to be left behind. So they do this whole getting married thing, and then he leaves. The one thing I did really appreciate was a lot of the scenes of the war preparations, the soldiers marching in the streets. And as we get to a little bit later, the Paris taxi fleet going off to fight against the Germans.
Yes.
A lot of those were really, really well done, I thought, again, especially for the time that the film was made.
Yeah. It takes a lot of set pieces and a lot of, things happening in order to put that on screen, and it's not something that we really see in that kind of depth and that kind of scale up until decades later, really.
Yeah, and I was, I mean, I went into this relatively blind. I hadn't really read any summaries. Obviously, I knew it was a love story, but there was a lot more of this, war footage and army footage than I expected to see in this film.
Yes. I feel like that was still very prescient on people's minds, especially as the movie was being made. It does feel a little bit Casablanca-like to me in the way that it kind of overshadows everything once the war enters the metaphorical picture. I feel like that's kind of like the only thing that people can concentrate on, which is
Yeah.
a real fact of war.
Yeah, no, it definitely takes over things, and once he leaves to go off to war, the immediate thing that we have to mention is the return of the sister. Literally seconds after he walks out the door heading off to his post, she's knocking on the door and coming in to beat up Diane once again. I don't know, like you said it before, I don't we don't see a lot of that with between sisters, but it certainly is really thrusting your face in this film, I think.
Yeah. Oh, and it sets up expectations about sister relationships in future films too.
But of course, this time Diane is a little bit. She thinks of Chico telling her, "Not, keep your head up, look up," from earlier that we were talking about, and ends up turning on her sister and driving her away. Which is, I think, the last time we see the sister. Which is okay for me. I don't need to see her anymore.
Yeah, point was great. We got it.
So obviously, then you said the war kind of takes over. We see a lot of different pieces of the war. We see the Chico and his buddies in uniform off doing some little comedy bits, I guess you could call them, with the food, and then we see Diane working in munitions factory, I think it was. Well, she's also getting hit on by Colonel Brissek, who and I had to go back and look. He, I think, was one of the guys with the aunt and uncle way back at the beginning.
Yes, you're right. He was their chauffeur or something.
Yeah, yeah, their little minder there. And we don't see him again for another hour and 15 minutes, and then all of a sudden here he is, obviously wanting to take over as the man in her life.
Well, in that first scene, I don't know if it was just me, but I think he kind of took a shine to her. When the aunt and uncle come to town, there was a moment there where he was basically begging her to say the right answer, and she didn't.
Right.
Honestly, feels a little Anora coded to me, but
Yeah, that's obviously a little bit of what's on our mind right now, but yeah, I could see that for sure. So eventually we get a scene where Chico and one of his buddies are stuck in a foxhole in no man's land. And I feel like that is, and I don't know if this was the first time it was done, but I feel like every World War One film ever has a scene where there's two guys stuck in a foxhole, and whether they're a German and a Frenchman, from different sides, or two guys from the same side, they have to figure out a way to get out. Definitely, you see that in All Quiet on the Western Front,
mhm.
both the original and the newest version from a couple of years ago. I know I've seen it at least a couple other times in those films. It seems like we see it now, and it feels so cliche. I wonder, because they were only a few years removed from that, was it something new and original seeing that type of scene in a movie like this?
Maybe. I would presume so, because I'm thinking about honestly, the thing that comes to mind most is Downton Abbey. When Downton Abbey started handling all those war scenes, you're right, everything happened in the foxhole. And I think that's not just military strategy that was really popular during World War One. I think that is also it's cinematic to see the going from two different worlds really and to have the camera shift really fast.
Yeah, and I mean, it's an easy place to confine somebody. It's pretty if they put their heads up, they're gonna get shot. They're stuck there, they really can't go anywhere, which in this case, they end up doing. Him and his buddy try and climb out and get back to the trench, and they get shot and killed, and as Chico is dying back in the trench, he gives the priest, who's the same one just happens to be the same guy that, they were dealing with back in Paris, gives him the little, religious pendant that him and Diane had when they got married. Then we cut back to Paris. We get Colonel Berset comes to tell Diane that Chico's dead. Of course, she says, "No, can't be. I don't believe it." Gobin and his wife come over from the neighboring apartment, say the same thing. She still doesn't believe it. And finally, the priest comes in, gives her the pendant that Chico gave in his dying breath, and then she finally realizes, yep, Chico's gone forever. And as she's grieving, the war ends, and the rest of the group in the scene kind of goes to the window and is cheering on that the war is over. And surprise, surprise, Chico's not dead. He's running through the streets of Paris, trying to get back to the apartment, climbing up the stairs. This is another great shot of the stairwell where now we see it from above the spiral
Yep.
staircase, and he's looking up, calling her name. He comes back into the room, and obviously they embrace, and he's not dead after all, but he is blind at this point, at least blind in his eyes. But of course, he brings back that religious aspect. He may be blind in his eyes, but he's able to see clearly with the love that she's given him. And everybody lives happily ever after, supposedly. Did I miss anything? I know I kind of breezed through the ending there, but that last 20 minutes or so, a lot happens pretty quickly, whereas
Yeah.
not a lot happens in a lot of the scenes earlier in the film.
Yeah. I wonder if it was intended to be a much longer movie and then people were forced to cut it
Yeah.
down. Two things. A big plot point that I really enjoyed and saw the repetition in was before Chico left for war, Chico and Diane promised each other that spiritually they would meet at 11 a.m. every morning once they heard the bell toll. And it's a reminder that both of them look up to the sky when they hear the bell toll and they look for each other.
Yep.
So it alludes to the meeting in the stars, but also the common theme of look up with courage.
Yep.
And it's commented on by Chico's war buddies and also the factory workers who are with Diane saying, they're just going to be gone at 11. Just don't look for them. They're doing their thing. The other big thing I wanted to point out, I'm so glad that I have something to talk about this because I am a lifelong Catholic, and that medal is the miraculous medal. So it's literally known as a medal that can bring miracles to the person who wears it and who believes in it and who uses it as a prayer device. So to see the theme of the miraculous medal and have that be the uniting factor between Chico and Diane when they've been separated is a really cool piece of Catholicism that is another layer towards their relationship.
Yeah, no, I did not know that. So that's really interesting. I like that. And circling back to the whole thing with the 11th hour, and it just occurred to me, obviously we were talking about taking place in World War One. I believe the armistice was
The
signed
armistice.
November 11th, 11th month, 11th day, 11th hour. So I think that can't be a coincidence that they decided on 11 o'clock for that all to be taking place.
Very smart, and something that people would have absolutely continued to celebrate in years following World War
Yeah,
One.
yeah, for
That's
sure.
a really cool thing to note.
That would have been top of people's mind for sure.
Yeah.
So we've talked about a little bit about the characters and stuff here. In terms of the actors, I've already talked about Janet Gaynor several times on my episode about Sunrise and Street Angel, as well as Charles Farrell talked about in Street Angel. Anything you want to mention about either of those two specifically, or about the director Frank Borzage, who I've also talked about before?
I just love that this was, Janet Gaynor and Charles Farrell's first pairing, really. They had both come up from being bit players and made their basic lead debuts with each other, and audiences went absolutely nuts. So it feels like one of those fated pairings, again, because of the way that they look on screen together, but you can tell they've got some chemistry together,
Yeah.
and pretty fast too.
Yeah, and they would, yeah, I think I mentioned it before. They went on to have 11 more, so 12 total films where they played these types of characters together. So it was obviously one that worked. And I don't think we've had I can't think of any examples modern day where we have someone with that long a pairing of, two leads like that. I think of something like Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan or something like that in the 80s, or Adam Sandler and Drew Barrymore had a couple of movies where they were the leads together. But that's two, maybe three. It's not 12 movies altogether where two people are
Oh.
playing together in the lead roles.
Give Emma Stone and Ryan Gosling another decade. We'll see how close they get.
Yeah, that's for sure. A couple of the other folks that were in this that I haven't talked about before. Ben Bard, we talked about Colonel Brissac, who shows up at the beginning and then a little bit later on. He actually worked as a stage actor as well as film actor, and also taught acting and had his own theater in Hollywood called the Ben Bard Theater. So I thought that was kind of interesting about him. The actor who played Gobin, David Butler, he appeared in Birth of a Nation back in 1915, the famous D.W. Griffith film. And then at the other end of his career, appeared on television in Leave It to Beaver, of all things. I love seeing the juxtapositions of folks like that.
Oh my gosh, that's wild.
And then I did also see, in looking this up on Wikipedia, that the director's family joined in a bunch of uncredited roles.
That's amazing.
There is a Louis Sr., Dolly, Mary, and Sue. I'm assuming those were all his children or maybe sisters. I don't know. So the director just brought in a bunch of his own family to fill some of those background roles.
Honestly, can confirm this happens all the time. Film director, husband. You have no idea how many times I've been an extra.
That's funny. Anybody else from the film that you want to touch on before we move on?
Honestly, I really loved the it's kinda hard to beat that central relationship. Everybody else does feel kind of like they're in it to tell the story, but there was something about that magnetism of Janet Gaynor and Charles Farrell that is instantly gravitating and really rewarding as an audience member. I can only imagine, like, getting really excited to go see the new Janet Gaynor Charles Farrell film.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, having seen this one in Street Angel, in close succession, I'm interested to go back and seek out some more of those, that they starred in together as time went on,
Yeah.
just to see kind of how that relationship evolved. Did it change at all as they went through multiple different characters together? Um, the film was set for preservation by the National Film Registry in 1995. It was the 13th highest grossing American silent film, earning over $2.5 million at the box office, which doesn't sound like a whole lot today, but
It's huge.
given that tickets were mere cents back then, that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
What I wouldn't give to pay 10 cents for a movie ticket today.
Oh gosh.
It was remade in 1937 as a sound film and also adapted for radio a couple times. There's a television version, a stage musical, and you mentioned Emma Stone and Ryan Gosling. I actually read somewhere that Damien Chazelle said that the ending of La La Land was inspired by the end of this film. So there's another connection for you.
The stars! I saw that, and it because this is a very Damien Chazelle-friendly household, the stars scene was instantly recognizable as something from La La Land. One day, we'll have to talk about La La Land versus Babylon, because that is a constant debate in this household.
For sure. Yeah, we'll definitely have to set up that conversation at some point. Let's see. Did you get a chance to look at any reviews or anything from either from present day or from the time that the film was released?
I haven't looked at reviews, and the reason why is because I love how it has affected modern cinema. And because I have come into movies later in my life, I kind of look at how older movies affect the movies of present. Because I got caught up in award season a few years ago, and that's how I really got to develop my own love of movies. I like seeing things like the La La Land connection. I like seeing things with my husband, and he's pointing out, yeah, that's certainly a shot that gets stolen today. And watching it alongside him, it was fun to be visually reminded of things that are currently happening in cinema decades later.
Yeah, I love seeing those connections too, and I'll see some of them from time to time, and I'll be reminded of something. But I love there's tons of YouTube videos of people who've just put a whole sequence of shots. This one comes from this one, which leads to this one, and seeing that progression over time is really interesting.
Yeah.
I did see the couple of mentions as I was doing some research that this is one of the more striking visual films of Borzage's career. Again, the only two that I've seen are this one and Street Angel, and I can attest that this is more visually striking than Street Angel. I think it comes back to that whole the war aspect. Those scenes of the men marching, the scenes of the cars, going to the front, the explosions, the fire that are in some of those scenes. And that's one thing you didn't even mention. The scene that leads up to Chico being trapped in the foxhole is the soldiers going over the wall of the trench, and they're with flamethrowers essentially, and it looks like Charles Farrell is holding a flamethrower with a big tank of gas on his back, which again would never happen nowadays. You're not strapping a big tank of gas to Brad Pitt's back and having him
No,
go over a trench wall with a flamethrower.
unless you're in Babylon.
Right, right. It all comes back to that. But it's just again those sorts of things you only get at a time like this, when movies were still figuring all this stuff out.
Yeah, that's true. It was scrappy and wonderful, and we figured out some really good technical cheats over the years, but live fire on set is always
Yeah,
scary.
yeah, and it wasn't just a little campfire. I mean, they were shooting fire all over all over the stage, assuming it was made on a stage of some sort.
Well, maybe it does take a bit player who's hungry for a lead role to be able to have the courage, as going back to that point, to say, "You know what? No, I'm just gonna do it and see where it goes."
Yeah. So at the Oscars, kind of mentioned it at the top, but Seventh Heaven at the very first Oscars, it was nominated for 5 of the awards and won 3. So it was nominated for Best Art Direction and Best Picture. And it won for Best Directing, Dramatic Picture, Best Actress for Janet Gaynor, and Best Writing Adaptation for Benjamin Glazer. Obviously, being the first one, it was the kind of the record setter for both of those. The 5 nominations would be tied again at the second Academy Awards, and then that record would be broken by the third Academy Awards with the film The Love Parade, which received 6 nominations. And then the most wins record would remain until the seventh Academy Awards, when It Happened One Night took home 5 awards. And actually, the top 5, if I remember correctly, directing, writing, Best Picture, and both of the acting categories went to It Happened One Night.
Sounds like a very worthy successor.
Yes, indeed. And it's funny, actually, now thinking back, there was the scene in Seventh Heaven when they go back to the apartment. There was another little tie-in. You mentioned, taking shots from other films.
Mhm.
It reminded me of It Happened One Night. So the scene in It Happened One Night, when they're in the beds and they put up the sheet between the two of them.
Yeah.
They didn't actually do it in Seventh Heaven, but it looked like he went across to another building and grabbed a sheet and some clothespins, and I thought, "Oh, they're gonna do the whole put the sheet up so that they don't have to sleep next to each other," but then he ended up going out and sleeping on the balcony. But I was instantly reminded of that in It Happened One Night, which obviously comes later, but it again, it's another shot that kinda carries through into from another film. Anything else, that you have notes on that you wanna to touch on before we wrap up?
No, I really this has been a really fruitful discussion, and now that I've talked about it with you, I feel like I've changed my mind about some things. When I first saw the movie, I thought, "Man, we can cut all like, seeing the scenes of war didn't really move the plot forward as much as I wanted it to on first viewing."
Mhm.
But now that we've talked about it and seeing the historical significance of being able to create those massive scenes, I now feel like the movie is whole as it is, and it's been really fun to talk about it with
Yeah.
you, so thanks.
Absolutely. So we'll move on to some final thoughts and ratings. I gave the film a 6 out of 10. I actually overall. Think I like Street Angel better when I'm comparing the two side by side, although that might change. For me, the production design, the effects of those big scenes elevate it a little bit for me in terms of just what they're able to do at the time. But I also thought at times that, okay, we can cut 5 minutes from this scene. We don't need them sitting there cuddling and just kind of staring at each other for 10 minutes. So that pulled it down just a little bit for me. But I think on a repeat viewing, I might bump it up a little bit. But this first time through, I gave it a 6.
I think I might be at an 8.
All right.
I now having talked about it, I think I was a little bit lower on it like you were. And yes, for modern audiences, I think we can trim some of that 10 minutes staring into each other's eyes scene. But overall, I do think the point was made. I do think it is a really solid script. And the structure definitely evolves over time, and you can see that they're exploring both intimate relationships in relationship to a larger concept. which is something that I really look for in a film. I think it's really solid work, and I wasn't expecting to love it as much as I did, but I'm really glad that I saw it.
Wonderful. Well, I will be sure to include a list of resources and links to any of the articles and reviews that we talked about, as well as a link to where you can watch it online. Maria, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking with me about Seventh Heaven. Remind people once again where we can find you online and what your work is.
You can find me at brunellobombshell.substack.com for my weekly newsletters. You can also find me on Instagram and TikTok and Letterboxd at Brunello Bombshell.
And don't forget to follow the Oscar Project at theoscarproject.substack.com. And be sure to come back for the final movie conversation for the first Oscars next Tuesday, when I will be discussing the first Best Picture winner, Wings. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you at the movies.
No matter wherever I roam, for me.